Thank you very much for presenting a positive side to the question of innovation from the ethical perspective. We don't often hear that. We're going to take the same format that we used in the earlier session this morning with questions from the committee, and regrettably, I'm not quite able to see the front row. And starting with Jason. And if you would either direct, oh, sorry, not Jason.
Greg.
Whose hand was that? Yeah,
That was mine.
Greg. If we would please either direct to a specific person or say to the panel at large, and members of the panel, if you would like to make a comment after the individual who's been named, feel free to speak up.
Great evening, Hastings Center. Thank you, everybody, for an interesting set of presentations that sort of cut against each other in very interesting and productive ways. This question is initially, I have two questions, actually, that both are about the role of what Bruce is calling command and control. And the first one is really for Bruce, but I hope we'll put Bruce in dialogue with Andrew and Jesse. And that is, can you put a finer point on your take-home points for us? You're calling for this third regime, the civic regime for governance of science and technology in this domain, gene drives. What can a report from a body like this committee do to create that, bring that into being, or can we do more than call for it and sort of identify the possibility of this civic regime, or is there something that we actually might be, in your view, doing to bring it about? And the problem here that I have in mind is what can we do in the face of the kind of deep disagreement that Jesse was calling attention to? Is there, when we make recommendations, should we be, is there a role for a command and control structure in bringing about this new civic regime? I'm sort of wondering, is there some sort of interplay between the civic regime and the command and control structure? And my question about the command and control structure for Professor Macrina is in many of the examples that you gave of moral responsibilities ranging across a variety of actors, it seemed to me that you often envisioned the questions, moral questions arising with scientists, but leading toward some sort of institutional structure where third parties are enforcing the best practices or the norms. Do you see a role for professional self-regulation, not just professional generation of moral questions?
Yeah, let me just begin, because I do want to come back to the question, the aspect of your question concerning what this committee might do with all of this. I was thinking, obviously, very broadly and longer term, but nevertheless, I do think there might be a partial answer to that. First, let me say that the dichotomy between so-called command and control and market is perhaps a little bit misleading, because both a kind of an expert rule-based system and the market system are very controlling of technology. So it's not really a contrast here between sort of anything goes versus you know, what some elites think should happen only. The marketplace is very selective in what it develops and doesn't develop. It's based on criteria, though, that are broader than the pure risk-benefit kind of approach and efficacy approach of the scientific elites. But it's not broad enough for ethics, in my opinion, because it is too oriented toward profit and limited considerations of interests. What I'm looking for is a discussion about governance, whoever the authorities might be who actually make the rules, a discussion about what the rules should be, because there will be rules, that is able to take into consideration a broader range of social and cultural values and effects, perhaps than either the marketplace does or that the elites are often prone to do, as they've shown in the past. That doesn't mean that the elites cannot engage and lead a broader conversation, but I think it has to be backed up at the grassroots level by a constituency of support for it. So my thought is that the committee could be very helpful in not only calling for public engagement in the way that almost all of the literature of science governance has for the last few years anyway, called for public engagement, but hasn't really, I think, gotten down to the question of exactly what are we trying to get out of that engagement, exactly what kind of engagement do we want, what kind of thinking by part of the public are we trying to encourage, and how do you create forums and structures that will invite a different kind of thinking about the common good and about human responsibilities for nature, rather than forums that simply really invite interest group lobbying, pressure, et cetera, of a kind of very familiar sort. So my recommendation to the committee is that when you deal inevitably, as you will, and I'm sure you're inclined to because all the comments that have been made suggest this to me, that you take this very seriously, and I applaud that. But I think maybe you have an opportunity to educate all of us about how to take that even more seriously than we have in the past. That's my point. In terms of the broad nature of the values that we should be engaged with, I am definitely not looking for more polarization. I somewhat disagree with the characterization of the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic, or deontological and consequentialist. I don't think that deontology is just about metaphysics and consequentialism is just about facts. I think they're both about what counts as facts, and they're both metaphysical, but in different ways, if you want. Science itself is metaphysical in this sense. So that characterization, I think, is a little bit too dichotomous for my taste. I think we need forums for a broader discourse, but we also need forums to overcome the polarization and to try to build on consensus. And I think we have a lot of opportunity here because the prospects of very, very important benefits growing out of these new discoveries are immensely appealing. It's a question of how do we triage? How do we, in fact, use this for the common good and for benefit without spilling over into a larger system that ultimately may have, many, many applications. I'm worried about the so-called free driver problem. I'm worried about the idea that this is going to be something that will resist rules and regulations because it's precisely so easy to do, and so many players might be able to sort of jump into it. I have a parallel worry about geoengineering. I think this is not for this committee, but for us scholars, I think it's very important for us to kind of consider geoengineering and gene drives together and compare the issues that arise there for both ethics and governance. It's a very fruitful line of inquiry, I think.
So, speaking to the issue of civic engagement and I think what you were referring to, it's imperfect, but I think there is, as already been pointed out, I think to the committee that you pay special attention to this. It's been written over and over again that probably the single biggest lesson from the recombinant DNA experience and Asilomar, even though the public wasn't invited to Asilomar, but 20 newspaper reporters were, who could only write their stories after the conference. I think that kind of openness and transparency goes a long way towards sending the message the scientific community wants the public and society engaged. Think of the fact that there are community members on institutional review boards and on IACUC committees, and I think they're still on recombinant advisory committees at the local level, but I know we have outside members on our institutional biosafety committee. So these, I think, are additive and represent good efforts, but there may be other things that if the committee doesn't think of them, at least they can call the question and see if there can be more thought about this, broadening this engagement. It's the transparency and openness that of what we're doing, how we're proposing to regulate areas that need policies, that sends the message that I think builds the public trust and assures them we're spending their taxpayer and philanthropic dollars appropriately to do research.
Let's say a couple things. I mean, one, yes, of course, the distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic moral problems is too cute by half, and it's too stark, because it's a logical distinction, and that's one of the things that we try to do, at least the way we came at this problem, is like, let's try to sort of get very, as clear as we possibly can on the sort of the terrain of moral objections out there, divide them. In the world, they're mushy, and thank God they are, right? Because if we were all that logical in terms of the problems that we had with anything, we would be so boring. So when, you know, again, you know, when I was at the University of Washington, shortly before I arrived there, I believe it was 2006, a very close colleague had his lab blown up because, you know, in a series of attacks on labs in the Pacific Northwest by a radical environmental group, on the assumption that he was doing experiments with genetically modified trees. Turns out he wasn't at all. He wasn't actually doing genetic modification, but there was this assumption that he was. That is just one, I think it's not that we should move forward with this discussion based on a very bad experience that we've had in those debates, but it's a good cautionary tale. That if you create an environment where there's such lack of distrust that people are even resistant to the messenger on the question of what it is you're actually doing with your experiments, and don't trust, you know, an explanation of what you're doing, and then people react to it, given whatever sort of combination of intrinsic and extrinsic worries that they have about the techniques or the technology, that's just a very bad environment. It's just not one that is going to create, I think, the best potential for this technology that we could possibly see, as we sort of tried to make the case at the end. In terms of what you can do to that, I mean, again, we say, insofar as you can, parse out the extrinsic worries and accelerate everything that I think the scientific community engaged on this is doing, and I think Francis was quite helpful in this in his chart, and sort of see how far we've come since the early days of, well, no, the ethics, that's not our problem, to, you know, now sort of building this in from the beginning, I think is helpful. Acknowledging the intrinsic worries, insofar as it's possible, encouraging thinking now about what it would mean to opt out, right? What would it mean to adequately and responsibly say to a community, we can take care of this particular problem that you're experiencing because of these mosquitoes or whatever that are causing this disease, or not. This is how we're going to do it. Now, are you going to get complete buy-in from the community? You're certainly not. And we don't have complete buy-in on fluoridation. We don't have complete buy-in on immunization. We know that we're never going to create a world where everyone's going to be completely of you know, one, I think, opinion on that. But I think the best way to answer that is, again, is to acknowledge those problems, see what you can to still deliver the benefit of the possible good, and then broaden the scope. And I don't know if this is what Bruce meant on bringing geoengineering and gene drives together, but there is a sort of sense in which there is a broader conversation here. And it goes by many names now, but like one of them is the Anthropocene, right? We've now so impacted the world that there is no longer this distinction between humans and nature. It's all just kind of one big mushy thing, and there is no kind of there's no external nature out there to have some kind of intrinsic value that one can lay claim to. So this is the world that we're emerging into. We find it happening and being discussed in very many different ways. the best way in which to have a responsible conversation about any particular technology is to acknowledge that it's part of a broader conversation and not just something that is brought on by this particular research program.
I mean, I would just add to that but of course that these distinctions are not bright line distinctions in real life, and I would also say that I think that's evidenced by the fact that the scientific community, and that we've heard sort of calls for objectivity or sort of neutrality, and sort of the notion that as scientists don't bring the ethics into the lab. I think that the recent literature and scholarship that addresses concerns related to gene drives in non-human organisms and the potential for germline editing in humans, which I understand isn't the topic of this committee, but the Academy will be addressing that question, and has been addressing the question. It's going to be the international conference occurring in December. That both of these, both extrinsic and intrinsic, and sort of the messiness of the moral world is showing up in these scientific papers. I mean, Esfelt talks about these in his work, talks about the extrinsic considerations. There's the red line talked about the scientific community on the editing of a human embryo, right? That it's a matter of great debate. So yeah, for the purpose of the presentation, it's the extrinsic and intrinsic distinction as ways in which to think about problems and ethics is a heuristic for sure, but way in which that we can sharpen the debate and identify what these key issues might be.
Yes, Joyce.
Thanks. I'm Joyce Tate from Edinburgh University. I was very interested in this extrinsic, intrinsic distinction again, which was there in all the presentations, I think, explicit or not. And as someone who's been involved in the GM crop debate in Europe since the 1980s, I've been trying to make extrinsic observations on the intrinsic considerations of others to try and work out where people are coming from in these debates and how the European debate evolved. And it's certainly much more complex than any single set of observations on what went wrong and how it could have been different. But I do think that the point that Jessica Patrick made, that if we don't take extrinsic hazards seriously, we might be vulnerable to intrinsic disagreements that are harder to resolve. I think there is no causal relationship there. I think the propensity for these intrinsic disagreements is within society, and where the extrinsic risk-related factors might be put forward as reasons for disagreement. They're not the cause of the disagreement in the first place. They're explanations for societal consumption. So I wouldn't agree that you could prevent intrinsic disagreements by being careful of the extrinsic factors. But I also wanted to mention, in light of Andrew Light's comments about moral obligations to do something here, just to draw attention to a report that I chaired from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, looking at ethical issues in development of biofuels. And the conclusions of that report were to put forward 5 ethical principles that should be observed before one went ahead with any development of biofuels. But there was a 6th ethical principle, which was that if you could help mitigate climate change by developing some new technology, and if that technology could meet the other 5 ethical principles, then you were morally obliged to develop that technology, taking account of the fact that it might be economically unsustainable or something like that. But if it could meet those 5 ethical principles, then you were morally obliged. And it's an example of another committee coming to a conclusion of the kind that I think Andrew Light was proposing.
Just briefly say, those are very interesting examples, but just very briefly in the interest of time. I mean, I think there's lots of very good examples out there in literature which actually do show that you can't, so look, I have cherished intrinsic moral views. There are things that I value. I have very strong views. I'm not a strict consequentialist, I'm not a strict utilitarian at all. But I don't pretend to think that, the fact that I can so eloquently defend them, that means that they're ever going to carry the day. I especially understand that every day when I go to work across the street and I have to negotiate with 196 other countries in the world to try to get consensus on something as complicated as a global agreement on climate change. So I think that and that's even a microcosm, I think, of the bigger problem that you have in the world on these things. But I do think that we can, and I agree with you, it's correlative relationship, it's not necessarily causal, but I think there are some very good empirical examples out there we can talk about later, if you wish, where addressing seriously extrinsic disagreements and bringing, this is the sort of the citizen notion that I think Bruce was getting into, for which there's a great literature out there now that's been done by Arizona State and a bunch of universities that have really made quite a commitment to this, of looking at how public participation in these processes from a very early stage can at least create relationships of trust, which don't necessarily solve the intrinsic objections that might arise, but they may mitigate them seriously and allow people to go, okay, well, that stuff is going forward, and there are some good reasons for it, even though I might disagree. So I think maybe the tamping down of some of the debates we've at least seen in some parts of the world on GM foods over the years is somewhat evidence for that.
So Wayne and then Jason.
That's right. I lose track of myself too. I'm Wayne Landis from Western Washington University. I have a really simple question. I noticed that the word risk is used a lot. I need a definition on how you're using that term. Because it's not, from what I hear, it's not the one I use as a risk assessor. So I need to have a clear definition of what you're using. And you're going, well, everyone knows, right? I just said I don't. And people talk about risk all the time. What exactly are you talking about? And this is for all four panelists.
I guess I'll start being on this end. We can go down the row. I'm not sure this is explicitly, and every time I use the word risk-benefit analysis in my talk, but generally speaking, I think of risk as a kind of a function of probability and consequence, seriousness of the consequence. And so when you make a judgment that is very probable that I'm going to find a nickel on the street, it would seem odd to me to say I'm at risk of finding a nickel on the street. If there's a very great probability that I'm going to have a heart attack up here on the stage, I'd say I had, significant risk factors. So I don't pretend to expertise in the field and how it's used, but I think in technology assessment and risk assessment studies, we must understand both the probabilities that something will occur, because something that is either impossible or highly unlikely seems to me not to be a risk, serious risk. But we also have to make judgments about what bad and good outcomes are. And that kind of appraisal, in my view, cannot be generated purely quantitatively or purely probabilistically. And that's sort of where I think the value-laden nature of the notion of risk may come in.
An unintended consequence that has the potential to cause harm. Unintended consequence that has the potential to cause harm would be a simple definition, I think, that could speak to some of our discussions.
Keep going.
I mean, I think we were using sort of the folk sense of a probability of a harm or unintended negative outcome.
Well, I don't have a normative conception of risk. When I use the term risk, I don't necessarily mean that it's necessarily a bad thing. So I would say that that's the difference here. It's sort of what Bruce's initial definition, but without the normativity, which I think there's acceptable risks or unacceptable risks. I mean, it's sort of, that's where it's the particular, that's when we need sort of some kind of framework on what consequences are we willing to accept or not. And that's a much broader discussion, and it's going to be different for different questions of policymaking. And so.
So we did come up with 4 different definitions, which is,
And
Yeah,
one
but
way-
they weren't completely non-overlapping, so it's.
no, but at least a couple of people talked about probability, which is actually the way we use it, is a probabilistic term. But when it's used risk and harms, well, potential for consequences, harm, in a particular direction, a normative sense, is part of risk assessment. So I was trying to differentiate when you actually talk about probabilities, and that's a very difficult thing for people to perceive. That's what I run into all the time. We do not do well with probabilities. That probability calculator in our brain is misleading all the time, and it's very difficult.
Yep.
So as a risk assessor, what we do is actually the probability of and especially for an EPA definition, adverse effect to an element of the environment that has a cultural significance, a cultural importance. So it is normative by definition and probabilistic and also deterministic.
I don't recognize that as a definition of risk. That's
I understand
environmental
that.
risk assessment. That's quite a bigger fish to fry
I'm just saying
than
risk.
just
I'm
what is
saying
risk.
Yeah, and I'm talking about exactly how we use that term when we're doing risk analysis. And
That wasn't your question, right? Your question was what is
I
our
know.
definition of risk?
no, I actually did. I just gave you the definition that we use in risk assessment, what we use in the definition of risk. And all I'm doing is just pointing out, boys, it's a non-trivial thing to communicate clearly what he's trying to do, especially for people who actually make decisions, hopefully not elites, but also a governance system that includes a number of people. So it was an interesting discussion.
Could I just make one more comment, since I think it's important, and I'm glad you brought it up. I think that one of the benefits of true civic engagement and interaction and participation and dialogue, if you get the forum set up properly, is that citizens do need to talk together about the way they understand probability and risk, and they can, through conversation and exposure to the experience of others, come to realize that many of us, all of us, are using sort of heuristics to think about what is probably going to happen and what isn't. Lots of empirical research on this showing how we make lots of errors, type 1 and type 2 errors. I was very struck recently by some research where a physician goes in and talks to patients, and then patients are questioned afterwards about what they were told. Physicians say that this particular treatment virtually never works, and the interviews revealed that the patient thought he had a 50-50 chance with that treatment. I mean, this kind of see, deliberation isn't just about what are we going to do. Deliberation is also about, how do we reason publicly and together about important things of value as well as about fact.
I think Wayne's comment actually reflects an issue that we're discovering that is also true of the elites, that terms are used in new fields especially in some significantly different ways, and there needs to be dialogue about how to understand them among the group doing the work before those of us in civil society can understand it, let alone regulate it. Jason, and you'll be the last comment because it'll be time for our break after.
So Jason Delborn from North Carolina State University, and this is actually a question on behalf of my colleague who's on this panel, who's not in the room, David Winikoff. He's asking, how should this committee think about community engagement, so community engagement, more locally affected population versus broader public engagement? Are both required? At what stage of experimentation, lab study, field trial, deployment? So if you could help us think about the distinction between broader public engagement and community engagement of locally affected populations. Thank you.
I would argue that the deliberations by the committee should strive to seek engagement at all levels, whether it's local, regional, or broad-based. I think just the idea that the effort is being made is part of this calculus that I think makes for a projection of trust and openness. So I don't have a prescription nor an easy answer, but I think it should be something that's talked about in the report.
My response is that certainly the general public needs to be informed and addressed, but the kind of civic participation that I envision really requires a grounding at the community level. And because people bring to the conversation a sense of place and a sense of relationship, and to some extent a sense of control. When we're talking as national citizens about, you know, very large national, international policy, I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel, you know, a very small voice in a very big room. And when you're talking more locally, also I want to emphasize it's not just sort of all sort of laymen, you know, coming together, but also get in touch, bring molecular biology and its expertise into contact with conservation biologists, with people who work in the field ecologically, in particular regions, so that if you're going to try to do some kind of gene drive in a particular area, you do have a good sense of the local knowledge, the local biological knowledge, as well as the sort of civic value-based knowledge. I think that would be a benefit. I think there are some examples of not sort of, as it were, consulting adequately with people who are going to be on the ground in terms of the effects of a technological innovation, causing unnecessary pushback and problems for, not because we want to stop the technology in its tracks, but because it's such an easy modification of the way in which it was deployed could have been made if people were aware of the local knowledge beforehand in question. I can give you lots of examples about how the public health disaster response was handled in New Orleans after Katrina, and on it goes. There's lots of examples like that. I think that's something that gene drive expertise and technology should take very much to heart, if at all possible. It's not this committee's job, clearly, but I could see rolling out a longer term, just as the scientists are working to try to really figure out what's going on, so too we as a community ought to be working to try to figure out what the meaning and implications of the impending science might be. You know, the Nuffield Council in the UK, lots of European examples of long drawn out public engagement campaigns with local foci are available to us, and indeed in the United States, although we've done a lot of that in the United States, it hasn't gotten very much, I don't think it's gotten adequate publicity. It hasn't been adequately appreciated, in my view, what you can accomplish that way, perhaps because it is taking place around dinner, you know, coffee tables and in private homes in small towns and so forth.
I'd just add very briefly, in the interest of time, is that sort of to revert to the earlier question of how we're going to be defining things, is that we don't necessarily have a clear definition of what a community versus the sort of broader public engagement might actually be. I mean, this is a gene drives could be, you know, are going to be global, right? So and so how do you define stakeholders at the global level? Or affect, you know, when I'm thinking about affected populations, you know, who is affected, who counts, and how do we know? I suspect that the next panel will be talking about, you know, at the very least, the imperative to be thinking about affected populations at the level of field trials, right? Those that are most immediately affected. But the question is a very, very difficult one to answer, which I don't, which I can't provide, and that in part because these definitions are going to be unclear and at times contested and without a consensus as to what they might necessarily mean.
Thank you all. We're going to break until 1 o'clock and return to hear about questions in middle and lower income countries. Thank you all very much.